Good evening, campers, dreamers, and babysitters, and welcome to our review of The Lake. So this was an interesting one. This was one that popped up on my radar a couple weeks back. Trailer had come out. I'd seen some still images, kind of the one that we saw in the background there. Pretty neat stuff. I'm a big creature feature fan, as I've said many times on the show before. But I'm also a massive kaiju fan. Like I love my Godzilla films. I love my King Kong movies. Anything in that giant monster realm is a pretty easy sell for me. So the fact that we were getting a new one left me really intrigued. And the other thing that left me really intrigued was them really pushing the fact that they are going for a lot of practical effects in this movie. And that was a big selling point. I know when I told you about it, you were pretty excited about that as well, at least intrigued by it. Well, we've gotten a chance to see the film. I went and purchased it on Vudu. And now, Luke, why don't you kick us off with your opening thoughts on The Lake?
For this one, I like my creature features, but I think I like them. It's weird because I kind of go by size. So something like The Thing, I enjoy quite a bit. Whereas, like, when we get into the huge monsters that are coming out of water, sometimes they lose me a little bit just because of their size alone. So this one I was definitely intrigued by from when you showed me the trailer after I can't remember what movie we had seen. And then you kept reminding me that this one was coming out. And yes, we did have a chance to watch it. And I will be honest, this one left me a little underwhelmed, I would say. I guess for me, the pacing here was almost unbalanced, I thought. Really weird. Like from the beginning, I think they went at such a fast pace. And then almost because I watched this, I guess, in two parts. I think I watched the first 35 minutes and then later on watched, the last half of it. And it seemed like they kind of interspliced all these attacks from that first, opening from that first 35 minutes. And then it really slowed down, it seemed like, toward the end of it. Probably the last hour, to be honest.
Yes, I can agree that this film definitely has a pacing issue, among other issues.
Yes.
To put it simply, I want to start off with some positives here, just because I know I do have a lot of critiques for this film. Big positive being, again, right off the top, those practical effects. When they are in use, I would say for the big creature, the big monster, it is really well done, really well shot in some places. I enjoyed what was on screen, what was presented. And I gotta admit, the CGI for the big creature, not all the time, but for a lot of the big money shots for it, looked really solid. I was impressed with it. Which is kind of baffling because when I start to get into my negatives, I have some critiques about how they chose to use that. And then I would say other aspects that I enjoyed is the film does look great. It looks like a, really, as far as color palettes and things go, and as far as like, really using its destination, it does feel like it has a bit of a broader scope than I anticipated. Going into it, I wasn't sure what we were getting with it being called The Lake, but, we go across, an entire city in this film. We get to go through all kinds of stuff. And I thought that was, something pretty impressive. I expected this to be on a much smaller scale. Maybe we'd be dealing with one village or one town kind of thing from the trailer. But no, they really kind of spread this thing out. But yeah, I mean, as far as that goes, those are probably the biggest positives I can give the film. Once we start diving into the negatives, but before I do that, Luke, do you have any major positives that you want to give the film?
I think some of the shots here were great. I think they were just like the shots alone of the location, I thought were very beautiful. So it's like, there's definitely some talent behind the camera in that sense of kind of really laying the land out like that. And like you, I was a fan of the practical creature effects. I think that's a real hard thing to get down, especially if you're doing a smaller budgeted film. But again, the practical stuff was real quality here. And it's like, I just wish, and again, I don't want to get negative already, but like, I just wish that this monster was used in a better quality film.
Absolutely. So I guess, yeah, we can kind of start diving into some of our issues with the movie. at this point because yeah, I have quite a few and I've written them down. You know, overall, where I want to kind of kick things off is, um, I really feel like the use of the monster was inconsistent. I feel like they did a poor job of, really explaining what its deal was, what its connections were, what its power set was, kind of what the evolution of the creature was. It really felt like they just kind of ham fistedly threw a bunch of ideas at the screen and loosely connected them. That really, at the end of the day, they never followed through on anything that they kind of threw out there when it came to the monster and its lineage and kind of what the overall story was. Because like there's a whole thing with eggs, and then there's I guess minor spoiler, there's two monsters, one that's significantly smaller than the other. And it's kind of like this thing where it's like you kind of follow that monster for a while, which I thought was fine at first, but it just turned into this thing where it's just kind of like, oh, so like we're doing this with like the whole thing with one of our characters and that monster having like a connection and everything. It's just, it got really weird and jumbled pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I'll say that was another positive initially for me was, we had this giant monster and then you had a smaller monster where you could, again, the bigger monster, slower lumbering kind of, can't really hide out or anything like that, where, you have the smaller monster that can wreak a lot of mayhem. It reminded me a little bit of Cloverfield with the little things falling off the big monster, and kind of attacking people. I thought that was intriguing, but then again, I don't think they followed through. I think again, this film has a lot of half-baked ideas where it's like, oh, if you would
Mhm.
have just followed through with this 100%, this could have been a quality film. But there's a lot of it with the monster itself, which I don't need necessarily like a full-on backstory of why this thing's here or where it came from,
No,
but
but
establishing like a lore of, you get scratched by it or injured by it, and you develop some kind of connection. Apparently, kind of, but we don't know 100% because they never really follow through with that. Like, establish that sort of lore, as well as like, I thought they were going to go farther with, the egg and everything, but it was like all this stuff that had a lot of potential that we never really got through. That, as well as a lot of lack of character development, where it's like we want to try and base these characters, but we don't really dive too deep into them.
yeah, and they try to say that this creature is like a mythical creature of legend, is kind of how they try to frame it with some voiceover towards the beginning of this film. But really, it does kind of leave you without any real major impact. I would say it just kind of, it feels like almost a storytelling device that they threw in last minute because they
Yeah.
realized they needed a little something there. Other issues that I have with this movie would primarily be with the cast and just the overall the acting that was portrayed. I understand that we're watching it with subtitles, so there could be a potential disconnect for us, being here in the States and not being native speakers of the language. But it is one of those things where it's like, even just the characters alone and how they're presented, um you know i uh I just had a hard time connecting with anybody. I couldn't focus there. The movie can't focus itself on like a central protagonist. It makes you kind of feel like you're following a group of people all in different points, but they never fully commit. I feel like there is one interesting pathway, and then there's a whole pathway that absolutely goes nowhere. And their whole like function really felt like it was added last minute to the script, where it was like, well, I need somebody to say this line of dialogue at the third act, so why don't I put them here, here, and here? Because they really don't interact with anybody else in the movie. And that was just frustrating. It really just, I think it really played into the kind of slog that this movie became by the end of it.
Yeah, and like watching this film, and we kind of have, these three different groups, these three characters here that we're kind of trying to dive into. But it feels like from a writing perspective, whereas if you're following a character and you're kind of building up, building up, building up to meaningful moments, it seems like from a writing perspective, they bypassed all the building up and tried to just give you the meaningful moments, but they're basically meaningless unless you have a build up of these characters. So it's like the one inspector's wife is passed on, and then his relationship with his daughter. I think they bypass a bunch of connective tissue and just try to give you these meaningful moments, and almost you don't connect with them because there's nothing there. So you're just following this group of characters that it's like, honestly, there were a few times where I forgot some of these characters existed until they showed back up on screen, and I was like, oh yeah, they are characters in this film, and it really just feels like that's we were facilitating just to get you to the end, and we need this character to figure this thing out and this character not to know this thing, and that's really what it feels like why all these characters are playing together.
Absolutely. And though I've been praising the practical effects, I could tell that there were definitely some limitations here and there, especially with the smaller monster. There's an attack sequence early on in the film, where you can clearly see that it is just a guy, wiggling around, which, as someone who's used to the kaiju stuff, like suitomation and all that, like people in monster suits and, back in the day, is something that I definitely get a kick out of. But for here, it was just one of those things where I was just like, I don't know if that's what you're actually going for.
It was a little out of
And
place.
it did. And then really I think the only big criticism I can throw at the big monster was it did feel like throughout the progression of the film, you really got to see the practical effects limitations that it had, because it kind of did the exact same thing with most every character throughout the film, where it's like, it's going to menacingly look at them, it's going to rear its head down by cars, do the classic Jurassic Park shot, all that. And it's just kind of like, that's really all we get with the creature. And overall, I feel like this film was a bit mismarketed. I don't know how it was marketed in Thailand, but over here it was definitely mismarketed to kind of make you think that this was leading towards a full scale attack, as to where it's kind of just it just kind of shows up, does some things, doesn't really come off as that big of a threat, and then movie continues, and then we get on to the ending, and it was just a really big disappointment there. I think that it's interesting that that's kind of the way they went to take the film, but I feel like the execution was just overall very poor.
Yeah, and I mean, you have this giant lumbering monster. Like you had said, we kind of go through the city here, but it, the first 35 minutes of this film, or when the smaller monsters are doing things, is really when the pacing is picked up and it feels like it's an actual threat. Whereas when we get to the bigger monster, and yes, we have this full city, the big monster does nothing. You know what I mean? Like, if you're gonna have this giant monster, there's an expectation here. When you're doing a monster movie like this, that it's gonna, destroy lots of things. You don't have the budget for that. I say keep it smaller, keep it in a village, and then just make work with what you have. I mean, I think it would have been more effective to have several smaller monsters than one giant monster, even though the visual is nice. And again, the last half of this film, it feels like the giant monster just stands around staring at people. Nothing
Mhm.
really happens. So, for me, I felt like there was no tension, nothing really built up toward the end of it. Even when some characters die, it's just like, okay, well, on to the next thing, so because you didn't really feel a connection with any of this stuff. So, by the end of it, I was just waiting for the credits.
Absolutely. But yeah, I would say overall, my final critique for this is really just that the ending is very abrupt and very jarring and unsatisfying. I think if you do end up watching the movie, you'll completely understand what we mean by that, because it's just it really put me off. Like the whole thing they do. Like, was that the same experience for you, or were you totally checked out by then?
You mean by like the ending that kind of
The
you're
actual
talking?
ending,
Yeah.
yeah, like the whole thing where they do the thing.
For me, I was already over it, but then I was like, really? This is how we're going to end this? It just felt out of place. Like, okay, it felt almost for me like a stretch to say, to be continued, like, please let us make another film. And, without it really being earned. No, like, for me, I just thought it was absolutely out of place.
Yeah, and honestly, I hate to be this guy, but I don't know if I necessarily want to see the continuation of the story. I think that the creature is cool, but really that's kind of the biggest redeeming factor of the movie for me. I don't think this is going to be one, even though now I own it in my digital collection that I'll go back to even regularly. Maybe in a few years, I might have more curiosity to check it out again, but this one just did not work for me. Overall, I got to say, I don't recommend picking this thing up right away. I would say wait and see if it pops up on a streaming service. and then give it, the once over before you go ahead and purchase this, because I feel like I could see a lot of people picking this up and being rather disappointed with it just because of how disjointed it is, just because of how the monster stuff plays out. And overall, I got to put a lot of that onto how the film's marketed.
Yeah, and for me, yeah, I would say wait for streaming on. I think it's just to see the monster effects. But as
Mhm.
a monster movie and as a monster movie fan, and if you have an expectation going into this, I think you're going to leave being a little more than underwhelmed on this one. So overall, yeah, wait for this to be streaming and then maybe give it a look see.
Absolutely. But alrighty, guys, it's going to wrap us up for our review of The Lake. So if you did check this one out, let us know what you thought. Are we off base? Do you think that this is the next great kaiju film, or is this just another one for the pile, and we'll see what happens next? I always want to sit in the corner of the monster movies. I was happy with, the pseudo creature feature that 65 was over the weekend. I thought we get the 1-2 punch here, especially because, we've had a lot of foreign cinema that tackles monsters really well, like The Host and things over the years. And it's just something where I was kind of really hoping that Thailand would pull out something special here. But yeah, unfortunately, it just did not hit. But other than that, guys, you can definitely hit that subscribe button if you're new here. We're on our way to 1,000 subscribers, and we got a lot of great content on the channel. Lots of recent collabs. If you want to talk more monsters or dinosaurs, we just did a collab with Alex from the From Beyond podcast, where we talked about Carnosaur 2, which was a whole bunch of fun. And if you want to keep up with all the latest and greatest with all the Scream content, we did work with Evan over at Rockland Graves, where we can definitely recommend those because they were a lot of fun to film. We get all our thoughts and opinions out on the first, fifth, and the sixth film. So yeah, other than that, guys, we got a lot of great stuff coming to you. And yeah, so I guess until next time, I'm Dylan Newell.
And I'm Luke Janesco.
And remember, stay scared.